few weeks in our class, but once I did, it stuck with me. I realized that not only did it apply to me, but to people and events throughout history. Her poster, a small sign hung with a single thumbtack, among many other flyers and posters, read, "Question those who don't question authority." My mind immediately trailed to civil disobedience, which is, by definition, protesting, usually a government, by means of refusing to obey with laws or rules. However, all protesting is done peacefully and without violence. Looking back on instances of this, what would have happened if Martin Luther had not questioned the church? If Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had not questioned United States policies on segregation? If the women of America had not stood up and questioned their rights in their country? If the people of Sudan had not stood up against their violent military control? If Malala had not questioned the Taliban's control over women's education? But what happens if you stand up and question? Question those around you. Question the decisions that affect you. Well, that's what I've unconsciously been doing my whole life, and what I now do with purpose. And I want you to have the confidence, the goodwill, and the passion to do so too. However, I do not mean to encourage disrespectful or insulting behavior. Instead, I want you to be able to fight against this sort of behavior, to have the poise, the courage, and the words to be able to maintain respect, but also put someone in their place. I'm a rising sophomore in high school, a good, respected student, but by no means a quiet one. I'm constantly calling out teachers and peers on their behavior, and I am respected for it. Some egg me on, saying just the right things to press my buttons to get a reaction. Some look at me in the eyes and say sorry. And others just walk away. Let me tell you about a time that I practiced civil disobedience in the classroom. A few months ago, I had a substitute in my history classroom. And in the middle of class, I decided to stoke up a conversation with him. I asked what he had done before he became a sub, and he told me that he used to be a driver's ed, gym, and health teacher. I took an interest, saying, "Oh, that's cool." And the next thing I knew, he was telling me all about his genius idea. Now, this genius idea was that teenagers should not be legally allowed to drive unless they had good grades. This threw me, because grades do not define a person. They don't reflect maturity or intelligence, and often grades are out of teenagers' hands. This is the point where I started to question him. I told him that grades should not define someone's future. They should not be such a limiting factor, for often teens have other responsibilities. These responsibilities might include a job that supports their family, a club or a sport, or even babysitting siblings. Not to mention, thousands of students struggle into no error of themselves, some because of a lack of resources, some because of disability, and some because they're having trouble at home. I told him that students should not be punished for these things, especially when that punishment could be taking away their transportation to and from school. At this point, my teacher had started to backtrack. Obviously scrambling, he stated that, well, not grades, okay, maybe not grades, but at least attendance. I told him that just like grades, attendance should not dictate your future. Not all teenagers have transportation to school. This is the point where he started to turn on me. He said that, well, if you had kids, you would make sure that they got to school, right? This struck me as odd, but instead of pointing that out, I said that yes, if I had kids, I would make sure that they had transportation to school. But that's not every family's reality. And just like grades, people should not be punished for that. Next thing I knew, he was walking away. No further comment. I just went back to my seat and continued working. However, within the next few minutes, he had to step out of the classroom for a few minutes, and he pointed at me. He put me in charge. I had questioned him, debated with him, and while he didn't appreciate that in the moment, in the end, he put me in charge. That just goes to show that people in power positions are not often challenged civilly. And if they are, they respect you for that. And while putting your ideas out there do earn them respect and awareness, there is a line. Sometimes a very thin line that anger and passion can make you stumble over. I, for one, have stumbled over that line a number of times. A great example of this happened a few months ago. I have a teacher who has the same study hall hour as I do, and I often go to his classroom during this time to get help with the content we're covering. This particular day, I had already asked permission to go to his classroom during this time, and he told me, of course you can. But when I showed up to his door, he stuck his head out and said, "You're late," to which I replied, "I'm not in this class, and you told me I could come during this time to get help." He didn't seem to appreciate or respect that comment. Instead, he said something along the lines of, "Go away, you aren't in this class." And the next thing I knew, he was closing the door on me. But not before I got a foot in the door. And when I tell you that my foot was the only thing keeping that door open, I mean it. During the whole conversation that followed, he was forcefully closing that door on my foot. At this point, I explained to him that he had told me I could come to his classroom during this time, and now he wouldn't let me take a step into it. At this point, I was angry, upset, and frustrated. I don't think anyone appreciates when someone tells you something, promises you something, and then takes it back for no apparent reason. I was starting to get wound up and ready to burst at the seams. I raised my voice and became more forceful than I would have wanted to. But after a few minutes of discussing with him, I realized that he was never going to let me in that class. So I took my foot out of the door and walked away, back to my study hall room. But that wasn't the end of it. For the next few days, I gave him the cold shoulder. Not talking in class, not participating, not raising my hand. The exact opposite of my usual behavior, usually being the kid who won't stop talking and participates too much. But after a few days, I realized that I needed to get over it. While he hadn't apologized, he hadn't even mentioned the situation and was acting completely normal, I needed to move past it. One of the reasons I was so hesitant to repair that relationship was because I was unwilling to take fault, even partial fault, for the events that had gone down. I wanted to blame him for the whole situation, when, in reality, I had escalated it. I didn't need to put my foot in that door. I could have just walked away. And later that day, I had heard from a friend that he had been having a really rough go of it in all of his classes. Today, I realized that I had a hand in the events that went down. But that doesn't change the fact that it was totally immature of him and irresponsible for him to take out his frustrations on me. Taking accountability for your actions is so important. It changes your attitude and your outlook, therefore changing your actions. You never know what another person has going on in their life, but that does not change the fact they do not have the right to take it out on you, especially if you have nothing to do with what they're going through. Some cases are much more serious than others. And sometimes, crossing that line is the only way to survive. You have to assess the situation you're in and act accordingly. For instance, Dr. King, while he used civil disobedience as a way to fight United States segregation laws, he also stated in a 1968 speech at Grosse Pointe High School that a riot is the language of the unheard. While he wanted to fight using peace, he noticed that it was necessary for riots to happen because those voices need to be heard in the midst of oppression. In Malala's case, she fought for women's equality in education peacefully by raising awareness. Learning to stand up for yourself is so important. And the basics of questioning are simple. Step number 1, pick and choose what you want to question. Don't just go after something because you want to. Have a reason. Step number 2, without raising your voice or becoming forceful, just ask why. Why something was said, why an action was done, why a rule was made. Even if they have a valid answer, that usually throws them. Step number 3, poke a hole in their judgment. And if there are no holes to poke, then revisit the idea that you might not be in the right. And if you realize they're correct, acknowledge that. Look at them in the eye and say, wow, thank you for explaining that to me. Step number 4, continue the conversation civilly, even if they don't. Continue explaining your side of the idea, but also hear them out. And continue asking why and poking holes in their judgment. If you continue to let them talk, oftentimes they talk themselves into an error. Step number 5, don't make the conversation last forever. Make it last just as long as both sides fully get out their arguments, and the length of the conversation also depends on the importance of the topic. Step number 6, if at the end of the conversation you didn't get your point across, don't agree with them just because they don't agree with you. Unless, of course, during the conversation you realize they are in the right. Then acknowledge that. It shows that you are not arguing for the sake of arguing. You are arguing for the sake of understanding. The 7th and final step. If you are unable to get your idea across, walk away. But don't let it go. If that problem or situation comes up again, point it out to them. Show to them that it's a real problem and they need to evaluate it. These steps are so important to questioning those around you, but also maintaining respect. And while this speech is aimed towards high school students, it's an important life lesson. And again, I'm not encouraging disrespectful or impolite behavior. I just want everyone to know their worth. I want everyone to know that if they want to, they can stand up and question. If they want to, they have the power to stand up and question. Thank you.